Throwing a Shadow by Jay Wilburn. Alright. John Orman became the oldest man in the world 61 years ago. This morning, late morning already, he sat in a chair shaped to him by time and stared through the open blinds to trees and sunlight outside. His eyes were still good. Should this be a different line? Probably. His eyes were still good. John's plumbing was top notch. Getting old was different these days, but primarily it just took a fellow a little longer to do. Alright, I'm going to back up and make that the same paragraph and then break into something new here. John leaned over to make a comment. Let's spell some words correctly while we're here, just for fun. John leaned over to make a comment to Abram, but of course he wasn't there. Couldn't be. They were born too close together, and everyone John knew growing up had passed a natural lifetime ago. He wasn't sure why he always forgot Abram Apollo. Let me spell that right. He wasn't sure why he always forgot Abram Apollo was gone. He had 2 wives for several decades each, but he never leaned over to tell them some random thought anymore. All right, let's stick one more line here. Nanites cleaned his neurons regularly, but the brain was the one organ they couldn't regrow for you. All right. He had new kidneys, lungs, liver, spleen, and he was on his third heart. They just grew the stuff in printers using his own cells. John New, being the oldest person left, came with privileges. Some of this backstory is probably going to be cut in the editing, but I'm going to just go ahead and get it all down now. John New, being the oldest person left, came with privileges. Doctors a fraction of his age took it as a challenge to keep him going. It was the competition, nothing personal. John turned his head from his sunken chair. The nurses moved about behind them. They always had business, even when they weren't poking or scanning him. He didn't know their names anymore. They'd tell him in a way that had the thinnest of kind veneers over it. But he'd been through too many to keep from mixing up the names. He had prided himself. Let me make this a new paragraph because I'm about to go on a tangent here. Not that the whole story isn't a tangent, really. He prided himself on remembering names and details about people back when he was a working man 2 centuries ago. Professionally and personally, he stored and recalled details about marriages, divorces, children, birthdays, anniversaries. All right, about marriages, divorces, children, birthdays, anniversaries, hobbies, and such for just about every person he encountered, even briefly. He still remembered a bunch of that stuff. Clients. All right, let me back up on that. Long dead clients, golfing scores, favorite teams of his nephews and great grandchildren. And favorite colors of an old business partner's 3 children. All of it was pretty useless stuff when they were so many generations dead. For a moment, John could see through the current medical staff at his care center. They still moved. Their steps echoed from floor to walls, and their voices rang clear, but he could see the furniture on the other side of them through their bodies and uniforms. He wanted to tell himself it was all in his head, but the view lasted too long to dismiss outright. Outliving your doctors over and over is a bitch. John grumbled. From the empty couch, clear as day, and just like his old self, Abram said, "I'd miss my mechanics," and who else would somebody miss besides a doctor? I'd miss my mechanics and handymen more. Anyone can look after your ticker. It's your engine and the little things you like around your house. It's your engine and the little things you like around your house that take too much retraining. John didn't bother to linger on the couch as he turned his head forward again. Abram Apollo died back before living over a century became the rule instead of the exception. No, you can't replace your brain, no matter how wonky it starts to get. Abram, long dead, John reminded himself. Agreed. Yeah. Centuries of data might be a bit much to ask of that wet sponge in your skull. Alright, John Orman. John Orman, oldest man in the world by nearly a half century, stood up without much more protest from his knees than they'd given in his late 40s. Still, okay, that's a complete sentence. Okay, still, he winced. He decided to go for a walk without telling anyone, even though he'd been classified a fall risk for well over 170 years. Alright, even though he'd been classified a fall risk for well over 170 years. His bones were artificially strong. More plastic than calcium. His skin was tight and new. Let's say relatively. Was relatively tight and new. Was relatively tight and new with all the treatments. And his third heart was still as strong as ever. Abram's ghost stayed on the couch, but called to John's back. How many boards can they replace on a ship before they have to rename it? John didn't bother to answer. as he hoped his dead friend's voice remained behind. None of the staff stopped him. Okay. None of the staff stopped him. They acted like he was more transparent than they looked to him this late morning. This late morning, late in his years. He glanced down and back to be sure he still cast a shadow. It was the only thing he did consistently these days without someone stepping in to help. He got as far as the front door without so much as a word from anyone else. Then he couldn't remember the code. He was allowed to know it. He just kept forgetting. Numbers were worse than names. He knew his student ID number from college. He remembered 7, let me write out the word, 7 different combinations of various lockers and mailboxes from his much younger days. Alright, what would be the third thing? He could pull up a Rolodex worth of phone numbers spread out over a profane amount of time, but not the code for the front door. John peered through the glass longingly. It was starting to drizzle anyway, he told himself. So he walked the perimeter hall of the facility. people started to appear more solid, but still strangers. John got company from time to time. People had fewer kids these days. He tracked it in a computer program in his room with his own family tree. It got confusing because the oldest members of one generation tended to overlap the youngest from another. He had recently lived long. Let me chart a new paragraph here. He had recently lived long enough to see the 10th. Let me spell that out. To see the 10th generation of his descendants He had recently lived long enough to see the 10th generation of his descendants born into the world. They'd named the boy Orman. There were dozens of Johns and Ormans scattered about. There were dozens of Johns and Ormans scattered about. This guy was the youngest, born to an unwed mother, attached to a punk of a guy. Alright, this, let's say new little guy. This new little guy was the youngest, born to an unwed mother, attached to a punk guy who would make their days miserable. Tina, Generation 9. Okay, Tina, the first of Generation 9 to have a baby. Brought the kid up for John to see. Papers. Okay, let's say the media. The media took pictures, video, and whatever the new mediums were. Then everybody left. Little Orman. Let's say littlest littlest Orman was born on John's birthday to boot. God help him and his too young mother. All right. John had seen it happen slowly. It was the fourth generation where it really started. It was the fourth generation where it really started. The first generation with great as a time divider starts to view the old man lingering around as something between a novelty obligation and a melting monster. As the generations go on, let's make it past tense. As the generations went on, family essentially became strangers. As he looked at a generation in his charts as one level of descendants, the people on one end wouldn't recognize the others for anything. Let me split this again. Alright, moving right along. The other end wouldn't recognize the others for anything. Why would they? Okay, why would they? They were separated by hundreds of years to their closest shared relative in some cases. Being related to the oldest man in the world. Being related to the oldest man in the world was like tracing your lineage to George Washington. It was an interesting piece of trivia, but not a relationship. John turned a corner and faced a set of wooden doors. When was the last time he saw wooden doors. Not in this place for sure. He opened them. He took hold of the knob. A thing which preceded handles. Thing which preceded handles, which preceded sensors, which preceded coded maglocks. The thing turned easily enough. Muscle memory so old that it sparked painful nostalgia. Muscle memory so old it painful nostalgia. Recognized the feel of the analog mechanics inside the door. John Orman, oldest man in the world by far, opened the door that shouldn't have been there. He stepped into his grandparents' house from what would have been the garage. It opened to where the kitchen met the living room, with its thick carpet. Hello? His voice bounced in a way. Let me put that on the same line. This will be in place of a dialogue tag. Alright. His voice bounced in a way that told him the house was empty. There was no real reason he should have been able to know that, but the place shouldn't have been here either. The smells were shockingly familiar, like traveling through time by being punched in the sinuses. They weren't old, abandoned smells. it was fresh cooking, even though he could see for himself that the impossible kitchen was empty. It made sense, though. Every memory he could pull up from this place, most of them oddly vivid now that he was standing in here again. Every memory he could pull up from this place, most of them oddly vivid now that he was standing here again, involved people long gone. His grandparents lost this house before John was old enough to shave. There were, but years felt longer back then when they represented so much of a larger portion of his life. He stared at the glass table that had been shattered in his first apartment at a party that got out of hand. The grandparents were long gone, even long gone by then, and their stuff spread out to children and grandchildren who cared less than they had. All right. He recalled being very young at his father's feet, under this table, looking up at the man's face, distorted through the fancy glass top. His second brother was still an infant. His second brother was still an infant on his father's lap. His third brother and his only sister were yet to be born. The sister lived to a ripe old age by the standards of the time. But John and her were the only ones, were the only half of the kids who did. Michael, Machel, sister Olivia. I'm gonna name these people. Michael, the baby in the lap, struggled with heart issues his whole life and died for 20. Mark, the one still to come, would be a police officer less than a month. Be a police officer less than a month before dying in a car accident off duty. He barely made it to 20. John couldn't even relate to a life that short. He barely made it to 20. John couldn't even relate to a life that short. It was like trying to understand someone who never stopped being a baby. All right. His grandfather sat at the table that day. Ants wandered in and out. John's mother came and took Michael to change him and administer his heart meds. John's dad and grandfather discussed the grandmother's health issues. They argued quietly over the right thing to do. They spoke and cursed one another without thinking about John listening. In the end, she had outlived them both, and John outlived everyone. He turned away and exited the door that shouldn't have opened on this. He turned away and exited the door that shouldn't have opened on this. He feared he'd get lost in these empty places where he was the last witness of what had passed. He stepped out of the house, but not back into the facility. John stared up at the bright ceilings. John stared up at the bright ceilings high above him. With the place empty, he could hear the fluorescence buzzing. That was a strange sound in a world of silent and streamlined things in a future he never expected to live long enough to see. Staring at the carpet, he finally placed the hotel this was in. It was one of his favorite work conventions. This one was full of old friends and good memories. Probably 7 years, interrupted by a couple years in the middle during one of the pandemics that tended to hit the world once a century. There had been many hotels before and since, many events that were fun, but few that came close to matching these heady days. The earlier years were better than the later ones. A cacophony of conversations leaked from the hall to his right. When he turned his head to identify voices he almost recognized. They were gone, and the room was obviously empty. He made hundreds of friends in this place that probably looked nothing like this anymore. All of them were gone. Like the kid under the glass table, surrounded by ghosts he once loved. No one remembered these moments or conversations besides him. A baby cried somewhere deeper in the dead hotel, and that chilling noise drifted down to silence, slower than John liked. He tried to think whether these years would have included someone born who might still be around. It was really close. Anyone he knew over the first 50 plus years of his life were gone. Most after that were gone too. The oldest besides him were mostly women, but men too, who, where we go with this, the oldest besides him were mostly women, but men too, who were scattered across the globe. These were not his buddies from the old neighborhoods, nor his friends from the industries he called his own, for what turned out to be such a small portion of his life. Part of him was glad he'd given up the grind before science kept pushing back retirement age. computers took care of a lot, but automation and plenty didn't overcome the human urge for fairness, even if that meant a harder life for everyone. People want everyone to suffer equally, or, well, let me take out that comma, or at least as badly or worse than they imagine they have suffered. It was old, dead Abram Apollo in his ear again. John was actually kind of glad for this familiar delusion. How do I get out of here? Abram should have stayed in your chair, old man. Screw you. Take it easy. Your sense of humor is so fragile sometimes. Everyone I know is dead, Abram, including you. Now I'm getting lost in my own head. All right. Stay cool. You know where the lobby is. Go out that way. The door I came in is behind me, though. That one's going to keep changing. Go out the exit, you know. John walked through the spooky, empty hotel he used to love once a year. The lobby doors blazed bright with sunlight washing out the exterior. These doors opened for him, and John, let me start a new sentence, a new paragraph here since we're doing a change. Alright, these doors opened for him, and John stepped into the hallway of his facility again. It was shorter to keep going around, but he decided to backtrack anyway. Alright. As he passed the front door, it stood wide open. That made no sense because it should have slid into the wall, not swing on hinges like in the old days. For John could dwell on that too much, Abram revved the engine of his old Ford, blew exhaust, boiled up from the back. That meant something was leaking where it shouldn't. But John supposed car that was long ago scrapped, now running in front of his care facility, was the bigger impossibility. Abram was behind the wheel with the passenger's door opened for John. Abram was behind the wheel with the passenger's door open for John. The old guy was young again, with pimples and ears to spare. Hop in. Let's have fun again, old man. Don't think I'm ready for that trip just yet. Who you holding on for? John shrugged, and his shoulders ached. He'd probably ask for another nanite injection tonight, unless, of course, he took this ride with Abram, his friend revved the engine one more time in invitation. Alright. Not today. John whispered. Maybe next time. Abram tore away in a cloud of dust. Abram tore away in a cloud of dust without bothering to close the door. John watched him go before he returned to his seat. The oldest man in the world watched the colors out the window change with the moving sun. He'd watched this dance countless times, but it was still beautiful, and he grew one day older. All right. So that is the first draft of Throwing a Shadow. I imagine it's going to need a little bit of work because I don't think the themes are together yet, but that's kind of what the editing phase is for.